This is the Good Morning Isla 200 show.
This podcast was prepared by the fall 2023 cohort of Isla 200 Islamic Civilizations at McGill University.
Grab a warm drink and tune in as our presenters take you on a deep dive into Islamic hate history with reflections on how they relate to contemporary Muslim life and culture.
Welcome to our podcast. As McGill University students navigating the diverse realm of academia, we invite you to join us on a journey of intellectual exploration. In this podcast, we consciously and unconsciously immerse ourselves in the complexities of thought, openly acknowledging and reflecting on our biases for a transparent and enriching conversation. Today, we will argue that Omar Ibn Said's memoir challenges Eurocentric historical narratives, distorting the vision of Muslim slaves arriving in the Americas.
Embark with us on a thoughtful exploration of Omar Ibn Said's life. To understand the complexities of his life, we delve into the backdrop of the West African slave trade, where he was born to a wealthy family around 1770. Abducted and sold into slavery in the United States, Said's journey was marked by tragedy, resilience, and an unyielding commitment to his faith.
As we situate ourselves in the turbulent era before the Civil War, we explore the presence of African Muslims in the antebellum South. Arriving on slave ships, many were unaware of their fate, and among them was Omar Ibn Said. We'll discuss the prevailing theories and misconceptions surrounding the lives of Muslim slaves during this period, challenging stereotypes and shedding light on the vibrant cultural and religious diversity that existed.
Omar Ibn Said's narrative takes center stage as we follow his remarkable journey. From being brought into the last year of the transcontinental slave trade to his life as a house slave in North Carolina, Said's story is a testament to his resilience and intellectual prowess. We explore the conflicting narratives about his identity, a scholar, a devout Muslim, or a potential convert to Christianity.
Examining the historical context, our focus sharpens on a pivotal shift in language use to justify slavery, both preceding and succeeding the Civil War. Before this transformative period, language was deftly wielded to perpetuate and legitimize the institution of slavery, which phrases like property rights and economic necessity serving as subtle tools of justification. Post-Civil War, in response to evolving social and political landscapes, the rhetoric underwent a nuanced transformation. Narrative now emphasized racial superiority and white supremacy as new justifications for continued oppression. This discussion aims to be succinct yet illuminating, revealing the strategic linguistic maneuvers that shaped narrative and perpetuated systemic inequalities throughout this critical historical juncture. Understanding this linguistic shift is vital for unraveling the intricate tapestry of historical justification for slavery and its enduring impact on societal attitudes. So in order to understand the subject at hand better, let's expand on some important topics. So first, what are the first European considerations regarding slaves?
The European norms lied in considering slaves as uneducated. In the New World, slaves and descendants of slaves were entrenched to remain as so because they were deemed as unschooled and unable to maintain a similar living standard as Europeans. Such prejudice emerged from two specific conditions. In the Americas, people were enslaved because of their skin color, while in Western Africa, they were obviously more susceptible to being enslaved because of their religious affiliations with Islam. It is important to recall that Marshall Hodgins, in The Venture of Islam, refers to Islam as the inner spiritual posture of an individual person and the act of submitting to one God, Allah.
Can we assume that Eurocentric narrative frames slaves as uneducated because of their religion?
Yes, that would be an easier way to put it. European narratives saw Islam as a barbaric religion, and thus conversion to Catholicism was practiced in the Americas not as an exception but as a norm, as explained by Abdul Malik Mujahid in his review of Servant of Allah African Muslims enslaved in the Americas.
So, to add up to that, could we even consider that Muslim slaves in America faced even greater difficulty than any other slaves because of their religious affiliations?
That's right. Their intersectionality created greater discrimination, one for being a slave and the other for being a Muslim, which deepened stereotypes associated with them being uneducated. To some extent, the conversion to Catholicism even became a prerequisite of a sort of emancipation, at least a psychological elevation. It shows how the Eurocentric narrative of religion was the only legitimate way to envision freedom. Muslims, because of their religious affiliations, were condemned to remain unfree, uncivilized, and uneducated. I think by framing slaves as uneducated and accentuated Muslims as such, the Eurocentric narrative served to legitimize European colonialism in the 19th and 20th centuries, as explained by David Wilkins in Understanding Historical Slavery, Its Legacies, and Its Lessons for Combating Modern-Day Slavery and Human Trafficking. We entail that they justified the perpetuation of slavery as the civilizing mission. The Islamic population was considered as uncivilized and thus needed the Western guidance.
Perhaps you could remind our audience what civilization means?
Yes, thank you for asking, because civilization is a very important concept in justifying slavery according to the Western and Eurocentric perspective. The word civilization is particularly hard to define. It can be categorized as problematic, especially when Islam is juxtaposed to it, because it entails that a population is civilized while the other is not, and thus is more barbaric and ancient. It is deeply rooted in an Orientalist view of Islam because colonialism and the slave trade viewed the people colonized as enslaved and uncivilized. Apart from its negative aspect associated with colonialism, civilization is initially defined as the extensive grouping of interrelated cultures, sharing cumulative religions and cultivated human heritage. It refers to a continuity of lettered traditions. It is important to look at the importance of civilization in European narratives because they immediately considered Islamic civilizations as barbaric, supposing that they had something better to offer. Also important and contradictory to the European perspective is that Islamic population considered themselves highly civilized. It shows how civilization depends on the prism it is studied through.
Thank you for that explanation. Would you consider that to a certain extent, the European narratives tried to erase and silence the Islamic civilization by making them slaves?
Yes, absolutely. We have very few narratives of Muslim slaves of that time. Many slaves' narratives were modified by their masters. Only very few, like Omar Ibn Said, wrote their memoirs in Arabic, making their narratives authentic and not modified at the master's convenience. In that sense, Muslim slaves were largely silenced. Concerning their erasure, this phenomenon was particularly observed through their forced conversion to Christianity. As we talked previously about civilization, Christianity is entitled as the religion of the civilized and the educated ones.
So if we follow this European-centric approach on religion and slavery, does that mean that if slaves converted to Christianity, they became free?
Unfortunately, it is not that simple. Diouf explains in Servants of Allah that Christianity was not a prerequisite for emancipation, but rather the justification for enslavement. Even when converted, Europeans would keep the upper hand on slaves in their civilizing mission, as they would accompany them in their introduction to the one and only just faith of Christianity.
So from what I understood in your explanations, it seems that the Eurocentric narrative not only justified slavery, but also created a hierarchical system where Christianity became a tool for maintaining control and reinforcing the idea of superiority of the Western civilization. So I'm curious about the long-term effect of this Eurocentric perspective on religion and slavery. Did it continue to shape societal views even after the abolition of slavery?
The impact of Eurocentric perspectives on religion and slavery persisted long after the abolition. The ingrained prejudices and stereotypes created during the era of slavery continued to influence societal views. Even after the physical chains were removed, the mental and ideological chains persisted. These biases contributed to the systemic racism and discrimination that affected descendants of enslaved individuals, including those with Islamic heritage. As mentioned by David Wilkins in Understanding Historical Slavery in Legacies and its Lessons for Combating Modern-Day Slavery and Human Trafficking, harms have been perpetuated and constantly recreated by the continuation of economic, political, and social policies at national and international levels that protect and maintain inequalities.
Thank you for those insights on Muslims and Islamic civilization during the transcontinental period. Now we'll pass you over to our colleagues for an in-depth analysis of Omar Ibn Said's memoir.
The text we are discussing is Muslim American Slave, the autobiography of Omar Ibn Said. In the early 19th century, 37-year-old scholar Omar Ibn Said was taken from his home in West Africa and enslaved in Charleston, South Carolina. After years of enslavement, he fled from the man that had enslaved him, was captured, and was put in jail in Fayetteville, North Carolina. He there began writing in Arabic on the walls of his jail. He was eventually taken into the household of John Owen, the governor of North Carolina, with whom he remained for the rest of his life. The collection was assembled by abolitionist Theodore Dwight in the early 1860s. Dwight commissioned top American scholars of Arabic to translate the texts to learn about Islamic and West African culture. The collection constitutes these translations, discussions about translations, and discussions about the importance of these texts. This collection is uniquely important for several reasons. It includes the only autobiography by an enslaved person written in Arabic in America, and thus it was not edited by Said's owner, as those written in English were. It is inferred to be more authentic because of this. It attests to the highest level of education and the long African tradition of written culture at the time. It brings to light the fact that many enslaved Africans were followers of Islam, contradicting the false notions of African culture. This text combats many oppressive ideas about enslaved African people and Muslims, and is a tremendous tool in contextualizing modern issues surrounding North American Black Islam.
Very interesting, thank you, Madeline and Al. Louise and I will now discuss some of the passages from Omar Ibn Said's memoir and analyze how these particular passages challenge Eurocentric historical narratives that are distorting the vision of Muslim slaves arriving to Americas by highlighting the education, awareness, intelligence, and religious and cultural resilience of these enslaved Muslims.
So, to begin, Yasmine, would you agree that one of the main dehumanizing distortions of the vision of Muslim slave that has been emphasized by Eurocentric narrative is the fact that they were all uneducated?
Yes, I totally agree. Bait Al-Fan website underlines this idea by saying, and I quote, "Enslaved Muslim who left behind a written record challenged the idea that enslaved people were a brute workforce solely capable of physical labor because they lacked the intellectual capacity that would make them deserving of independence and freedom." More particularly, Omar Ibn Said's memoir challenges this narrative since he was a Muslim scholar. He alludes to passages of the Quran in his memoir.
Do you have a particular quote in mind?
Yes, the very first paragraph of his autobiography is a Quranic fragment. I quote, "In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, may God bless our Lord Muhammad. Blessed be he in whose hand is the mulk and who has power over all things." These are ayahs from the Quran, 67th Surah, Surat Al-Mulk.
And what does al-mulk means exactly?
Glad you ask. As mentioned by Ala Arlis, the scholar who translated this memoir in English, the noun al-mulk comes from the tripartite Arabic root malaka, meaning both to own and to have domination. In Islam, everything belongs to God and nothing to men. This is a very clever reference from Said, since the title of the surah is a perfect allusion to slavery, absolute power through ownership.
Wow, do you think that Said wrote this as an opening statement to criticize slavery and the position he was in?
Yes, I do. Said was very intelligent, and as mentioned by Willis in her article, revolutionizing literacy, the life of Omar Ibn Said, Said stealthily applied sophisticated literacy skills to contest living under anti-black racism and channel enslavement through his rhetorical and strategic use of the Quranic surahs and ayahs such as this verse, which is in Surah 67.
But did the slave owner allow Said to criticize the white supremacist system and to write about anti-racism?
No, but this is because Omar Ibn Said rhetorically used Quranic verses in the face of his oppressors without their knowledge. He does so to boldly declare his humanity and therefore go against the system that tries to dehumanize him. He was able to do so because of their lack of knowledge of Islam and ancient Arabic, as well as their unwavering belief in white supremacy of his owner. This was also explained by Willis.
I was wondering, when did Said start learning about Islam?
Said started studying the Quran in Arabic at the age of 6. He studied for 25 years. He traveled in Africa, more specifically in Bandu and in Futa, where he sought knowledge under several sheikh. One called Muhammad Said, which was his brother, and the others were Sheikh Suleiman Kimba and Sheikh Jibril.
What does sheikh mean exactly?
Good question. According to Britannica Dictionary, a sheikh is an Arabic title of respect dating from pre-Islamic antiquity. It strictly means a venerable man of more than 50 years of age. The title sheikh is especially borne by heads of religions, chief of tribes, and headmen of villages and of separate quarters of town. It is also applied to anyone who has memorized the whole Quran, however young he might be.
Great, thanks. I was wondering, when was Said captured?
Said was captured at the age of 37 years old by an army that invaded his country. Therefore, he knew how to write and read in Arabic very well, which distorts the Eurocentric idea that slaves were uneducated and illiterate. I agree with Willis when she says that Omar Ibn Said's autobiography illustrates agency, brilliance, faith, humanity, intellect, literacy, and voice. His autobiography articulates an uncompromised understanding of Black humanity.
Yes, he really did distort Eurocentric narratives of Muslim slaves that were depicted as uneducated and worthless. Are there any other instances in the text that show how educated Said was?
Yes, as a Muslim scholar, the 5 pillars of Islam are mentioned in his autobiography. First, the Shahada, which marks your entry into the religion. You shall bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger and that there is no God but Allah. Said states, "May God bless our Lord Muhammad," on the first page of his memoir. This proves how dedicated Said is still to the Islamic religion.
True. I remember reading about the 5 pillars of Islam in the Michael Sells reading, Approaching the Quran. The Said mentions Ajn.
Yes, he does. He says, "I used to walk to Mecca and Medina as did those who were able." He states doing pilgrimage, which are also part of the 5 pillars of Islam, and proves how devoted he was to his religion.
Is this a lot mentioned?
Yes, he explicitly states that he used to pray 5 times a day. I quote, "I used to walk to the mosque before dawn and to wash my face, head, hands, feet. I also used to hold the noon prayer, the afternoon prayer, the sunset prayers, and the night prayers."
Very interesting. But overall, thank you, Yasmine, for telling us more about his religious education and really showing how this religious education and the way it is presented throughout his memoir really debunks Eurocentric narratives presenting slaves as uneducated. I have a question for you, Yasmine.
Yes?
Do you speak Arabic?
Unfortunately not. Do you?
No, me neither. That means that the version of the memoir we've been discussing this whole time is not the original one that was written by Omar Ibn Said.
You are right.
Therefore, would you mind talking about the translator, since I know that, as we learned in class, that there can be many translations of the same text that will affect the meaning of the text itself?
Yes, for sure. So the version we analyzed was done in 2011 and is translated by Isla, who is Associate Professor in Comparative Literature and English at Yale. Arias, one of the reasons why we chose such a recent translation is because it took a long time to assemble all of the manuscripts together and therefore translate them all. Moreover, the first translation was done by Isaac Bird in the 19th century. Scholar Carl Ernst highlights that how older translations were often mistranslated or missing accuracy on the basis that Omar Ibn Said's original memoir was unintelligible or even written in bad Arabic. Ernst argues that those scholars simply lacked the proper technological tools or expertise to translate a centuries-old memoir.
Great, thanks a lot. And are there specific aspects of his memoir that are interpreted differently depending on the translation?
Yes, as the scholar Shimmerin mentions, some aspect of his life can vary a lot from one translation to another. Was he an experienced scholar who memorized vast passages of the Quran and demonstrated great knowledge of it, or were his texts written in bad Arabic? Translators also argue on his religion and conversion. Was he a devout Muslim that always maintained his faith to Allah, or did he convert to Christianity? All of these questions have different answers depending on the translation you read.
Yeah, and I really got the impression that our translation kind of stepped out of the former ones where, for example, his conversion was very clear because it was made in recent years and by a scholar much more critical of Eurocentric narratives trying to impose certain ideas on Omar Ibn Said's work. We'll definitely explore a bit later on how his conversion is an aspect that's specifically talked about in our translation and how this maybe change our perception of his conversion while reading. So an aspect of the memoir I found particularly interesting was when Said wrote, "I cannot write my life. I have forgotten much of my talk as well as the talk of the Maghreb." The sentence, "I cannot write my life," comes back on another occasion later on in his memoir. To me, it somehow nuances the idea that Said wrote without constraint or fear. It sheds light on the trauma that might have refrained him from writing about devastating parts of his life. It also betrays the alienation he feels towards his own people and home country after years of enslavement and isolation within white Christian homes.
I agree, but he still had the freedom to write what he wanted since he wrote in a language slave owners could not understand.
Yeah, but the emotional and psychological impact of the abuse and displacement he faced and his condition of enslavement and subjugation to white settlers must have impacted his work and what he wanted or felt comfortable talking about.
Yes, I believe scholars Ernst and Mbe in the first chapter of their book, I Cannot Write My Life, Islam, Arabic, and Slavery in Omar Ibn Said's America, comment on how Said scarcely talked about his grief and memories from his homeland in his memoir and often chooses to focus on his masters.
Yeah, this definitely can be regarded as an example of memories and narratives that are absent from his memoir, probably as a result of the trauma and grief he feels from his violent and merciless displacement.
But do you feel like these missing pieces and narratives takes away from the meaning we can draw from this memoir?
No, definitely not. It's just a context of oppression and enslavement we have to take into consideration when diving into his work, and that can enlighten the way we look at sources retelling his life. We also should underline that while his autobiography depicts white slave owners' positive reaction to his literacy, such reactions were very uncommon in other states where literacy among enslaved people was illegal.
That's definitely something to consider. Do you think some sources erase the impact enslavement might have on Said?
I think many articles portray his last owners, the Owens, as benevolent and kind, and the relationship with Said as almost an equal one. But while Said speaks well of the way the Owen treated him, like when he wrote, I quote, "They are good men, for whatever they eat, I eat, and whatever they wear, they give me to wear." This relationship he had with the Owen family cannot be decontextualized from its context of enslavement, subjugation, and inequality.
Yes, definitely. So do you think some of the work written in the aftermath of his death used his unique story to justify slavery in a way?
Sadly, yes. Like many articles written shortly after his death put a strong emphasis on his unique character and exceptional intellect. This kind of characterization emphasized the idea that he was an exception to other slaves and thus treated better than them.
I think scholar Yasmine Ali looked into some of these articles more closely, like the article called Prince More by the Christian Advocacy released in July 1825.
Yeah, she did. In this article, she analyzes the use of language characterizing Said as, I quote, a peaceful subject, not a despot, or describing his, I quote, small hands and feet. She uncovers the racist stereotypes of Muslims being despotic and strong-tempered associated with the Orient. She also highlights how the notion that the bodies of slaves are ultimately a commodification slave owners capitalize from is pervasive in the text, as its description of Said's frail body somehow excuses his inability to perform the strenuous labor he and other Muslim slaves were destined to endure in this context.
Articles like these really make me question what led the slave-owning elite to conserve part of Said's written work into archives, and how much they distorted his life to consolidate their anti-abolitionist discourse.
Yeah, but analyzing how the works and interpretation of Said's life and memoir have evolved over decades tell us a lot about the stereotypes and ideologies that were particular to those respective eras.
That's true. But by the way, do you think that Said's presumed conversion to Christianity falls into the distortion and stereotypical Eurocentric narrative of the time?
I think his conversion is a very interesting and debated topic that many scholars called into question in the past decades, like scholar Diouf, which defines it as a pseudo-conversion in her book The Servants of Allah.
What does pseudo-conversion refer to?
Well, this term underlines how studying and converting to a new religion was often forced upon Muslims in Christian societies and did not result into fervent and genuine faith.
So was Said forcibly converted?
Well, he does narrate that, I quote, General Jim Owen and his wife used to read the Bible. They used to read the Bible to me a lot. But the youth, beyond questioning the validity and consent of these conversion, eliminates how enslaved people negotiated their Christian conversion with their faith in Islam.
This is visible in the text because despite his recent Christian education, Said still opens his memoir with a Quranic verse. But what should we make of the parts of the memoir where Said clearly communicates his Christian faith, like when he writes down Gospels from the Bible?
Personally, I got the impression in these parts that Said understood his Christian education from a Muslim lens.
You mean that he used the years of theologic instruction he received in his home country to interpret and understand what the Owen family was teaching him through the Bible?
Yeah, exactly. We can dive in a specific passage where his connection is explicit, if you'd like.
Sure, let's do it.
All right. Well, in his memoir, Said mentions how the Owens read the Bible to him a lot and goes on to write, I quote, Allah is our Lord, our Creator, and our Owner, and the restorer of our condition, health, and wealth by grace and not duty, according to my ability to open my heart to the Bible, to the path of righteousness.
This is a part of Psalm from the Bible, right?
Yeah, it is a part of a psalm. But then he goes on to write, I quote, Praise be to Allah, the Lord of worlds, many thanks, for he grants bounty in abundance.
Isn't this from another text?
Yeah, this sentence is actually from an important text of Islamic law and theology, the Muqtasar on God's generosity. Scholars like Dr. Colm Ernst argue that this passage is a remarkable example of the way Said understands the Bible through the text he studied in his prior religious education and really shows the connection between the two.
I feel like this memoir does more than just question Said's conversion. It truly challenges the Eurocentric narrative portraying enslaved individuals as passive recipients of Western influence.
I agree. I think there's no point in searching for an absolute truth regarding his conversion. We rather should focus on the multiple ways in which Said manifests his agency and intelligence and the sort of fluidity he has between moving from one religion to the next, partly by using Arabic to hide his Muslim religious writings and thus have the freedom to sort of navigate those two religions, and also by weaving his Christian learnings into his rich religious education that lasted over 2 decades before his enslavement.
Yes, it demonstrates enslaved people's ability to negotiate their religion and faith with their environment.
Yeah, this text really challenges the notion of a monolithic religious experience among enslaved people, and which was often used as a justification for the enslavement in Western historical narratives.
What do you mean?
Well, there is a century-old Eurocentric narrative justifying slavery by the presumed enlightenment and conversion of Muslim people. Omar Ibn Said's memoir highlights the resilient Muslim slave showed in preserving their culture and religious identity, and thus undermines this narrative. And Said also depicts the important agency, intellectual commitment enslaved people showed in their negotiations of Christianity and Islam.
Yes, I feel the more we dive into Said's work, the more it feels like it touches upon so many different aspects of his personhood and really challenges the portrayal of slave as brute forces lacking the intellectual and cultural depth that make others deserving of freedom at the time.
Yeah, the memoir challenges fundamental Eurocentric narratives, dehumanizing slave, and like you said, showing them as a brute workforce and thus invisibilizing their agency and intelligence. But it also questions more intricate aspects of this and to like these antebellum narratives in America, like the idea that conversion somehow justified enslavement, which we explored.
So true.
Yes, definitely. But something I picked up on, however, was that some things did feel very foreign to him. Like in the passage you mentioned, the concept and idea of jail, which he spells Geel, and for which he doesn't find an Arabic word or concept. Or when he wrote, I quote, and in a Christian language they sold me. These concepts are so foreign to him, he is unable to find words in Arabic that correctly encompasses them, and the violence and subjugation being sold into slavery in America entailed. His reference to a Christian language really underlines the completely distinct meaning of imprisonment and slavery held in Europe and America, and how it is incomparable to the way slavery was practiced in West Africa.
It seems surprising that he didn't fully grasp these concepts because slavery was not uncommon in West Africa. Diouf, in her book Servants of Allah, mentions how the people being taken from West Africa to America and Europe had already experienced life in slave society.
Yeah, that's true, but scholar Diouf also states in page 26 that although African slavery did not follow a singular model depending on the region, people, and time concerned, there still were, I quote, huge differences with American slavery.
Like what?
Well, Diouf explains how these differences were found in the way people became slaves, their treatment in Africa, and how this created a fundamentally different type of relationship between the slave and the slave owners.
Doesn't she also mention that slaves could be redeemed or liberated?
She does, and this had a great influence on the way slaves were perceived and their overall status. And hence, in Diouf's word, the absolute chasm that existed between the slave and the slave owners in the Americas was unknown in Africa. I also believe that Eurocentric narratives describe Muslim slave as being lost and uncultured.
Eurocentric narratives did have that type of dialogue that portrayed slaves as completely disoriented, but this is obviously fake. To talk about Said's memoir solely, he seems to always know approximately where he is and what is the duration of his stay. In the passage from page 63, he mentions Charlestown, sailing for a month and a half, a man speaking to his father, walking for 12 miles, staying in jail for 16 days and night. This shows how precise Said is, since his time frame and locations are very detailed.
Very true. He also understood the relationship between the people that he saw, and he knew their names.
Yes, this proves how resourceful and clever Said had to be to find his way in an unknown country with different culture and norms.
This definitely challenges Eurocentric narratives wanting to portray slaves as disoriented by showing how accurate and how aware it is of his environment.
This really challenges Eurocentric narratives claiming that slavery was a pervasive problem everywhere which they did not create.
Indeed, Eurocentric narratives tend to erase the harm and violence of their massive enslavement by arguing it was a common practice in Africa too. But Said's memoir really debunks these narratives by honestly underlying how Western practices of slavery were permeated by a violence, dehumanization, and abuse unknown to slave and slave owners in West Africa.
Thank you so much, Louise and Yasmine, for that insightful analysis. So now we want to start by giving some kind of historical context to basically a more modern engagement of the importance of Omar Ibn Said's text, and especially how it relates to the erasure of the Black Muslim experience. So the first thing we want to talk about is that there exists this false North American idea that Black Muslims arrived during the Civil Rights Movement. Black Muslims have been actually in the United States for centuries, of course, and this is really highlighted, we think, in the book Servants of Allah, African Muslims Enslaved in the Americas. So I think Madeline has a story to share from that book that really illuminates this.
When I was reading the book, there was a quote that stated, "War and conflict have always supplied the largest masses of men from West Africa to the New World," and the same idea was followed by the Marabouts War, which arose in 1673 with the leader of the Marabouts, Nasir al-Din, staging a jihad to override the pagan rulers. The leader was welcomed by the population that had been traumatized and demoralized by the rapid growth of the Atlantic slave trade. However, the peace would soon be disrupted when Nasir al-Din would die in battle, and one of the leaders who had been put in place to watch over a section of the new community turned against those who had put him in power and terrorized the villages and burned the homes and crops. This terror provided quantities of captives for the Atlantic slave trade and many more afterwards, and this resulted in many selling themselves and their children for food, risking enslavement and being sold to the Europeans. The war was devastating, and the defeat of the Marabouts led to countless of Muslims being sent to the New World as slaves.
So these historical kind of dialogues and narratives of Black Muslims being displaced and taken to the U.S., they exist, but they are often overlooked and overshadowed. And this kind of like creates a baseline for, I think, the historical and continuous and even contemporary erasure of the Black Muslim experience, identity, narrative, history, etc. And so I think, like, in understanding, like, in reading these texts, like the Omar Ibn Said that we will soon talk about, and Servants of Allah, like, it is especially important to think of, like, reframing, you know, how we see history and just, like, opening our ears to this experience that has been so often intentionally overlooked and overshadowed. So the next erasure of Black Muslim narratives and identity that we wanted to talk about was within the Civil Rights Movement. So while evidence has been provided about there being a Black Muslim population in the U.S. for centuries, the impact they had on the Civil Rights Movement is again something left out of history, either intentionally or unintentionally. So to start, one of the most prolific leaders of the Civil Rights Movement, Malcolm X, was Muslim, and this is something often not taught in the school system. Me personally, I'm from Vancouver, and we didn't talk about Malcolm X at all in school. Maybe you want to speak a little bit on what you learned?
I'm from the United States, and I can mention that we do mention Malcolm X, but when he is talked about, it is normally only in regard to Black History Month, and he's not talked about in the same light as MLK is, and I think some of that probably stems from his political beliefs and versus what MLK stood for, and while MLK, there's no direct mention, it can be, there's inference that the Civil Rights Movement was spearheaded by the Black churches, and part of that can be connected to how MLK was a preacher and in the Christian churches and such.
Right, so, like, when you learned about Malcolm X, was there any mention of his Islamic faith at all?
No, he wasn't someone who was, not that he wasn't seen in a bad light, but wasn't seen in the same regard as MLK. And
right. No
mention of Islam or anything.
Okay, interesting. So purely a political figure, no, like, religious background or
no, none at all.
So it's very interesting because Malcolm X actually would rise to be the second highest ranked member of the Nation of Islam, which is a American Black Islamic collective. And there's a lack of connection often in interpretations of Malcolm X's political ideology and the connection to his faith. They are almost always streamlined as two different things, and as though one could not affect the other. So his Islamic faith is often very overshadowed or kind of ignored, almost like turned a blind eye.
And it's kind of astounding because Malcolm X would make a hajj to Mecca, where he would see people of all different races and ethnicities following the same principles of Islam. And this vision would cause Malcolm to distance himself from the NOI. because the NOI preached black supremacy. However, he stayed a very devout Muslim and would continue to follow traditional Islamic beliefs throughout his life.
Yeah, and also in Faith or Fight in the African American community, the author, Sama Abdurraqib, she mentions how she was, taught very early on that she had religious and racial affiliation with Malcolm X. So when the movie by Spike Lee, Malcolm X, was released in 1992, Abdurraqib remembers being very excited for the movie to come out. It was the first time someone like her was going to be on the big screen. And while the movie was good, the one critique she remembers having is how the film focused a lot more on the politics of his early life and completely skimmed over his religious life, not mentioning anything about Hajj or involvement with the NOI or his later life as a Sunni Muslim. And so this narrative is actually presented as fragmented. So they also presented kind of that his politics did not inform his religion and vice versa, and that these things were mutually exclusive, and he could only show a political ideology and not really a religious one.
And these criticisms connect back to Islam in the Civil Rights Movement by Said Simwe, and how the black Muslim identity is often overlooked, and that while it may be stated, well, it does not mean that it has not been there. So the topics of Islam are been omitted from history for centuries, and it's been mostly due to the ignorance and unfamiliarity many historians and people have with the topic of Islam being in the Americas for centuries. And this is seen because Islam present day is viewed as being a quote-unquote newer religion being brought over by immigrants, but as we've been talking about, that's not true at all.
It's interesting, not only have the historical narratives of black Muslims been overshadowed and suppressed, but also the contributions within movements of black power, and that intersectionality I think is really important to acknowledge.
Yeah, I agree.
So the third thing we want to talk about is the erasure of black Muslim identity, contribution, and existence experience even within our community in contemporary present day. So Umalker Idil Khalif is a Somali Montrealer who loves and nurtures her Muslim faith, but she says she rarely worships in a mosque. So she actually describes her experience with going to the mosque as very painful. As a black Muslim woman, she feels unwelcome or outright ignored in many Quebec mosques. And actually, because of her intersectional experience and her identity, she co-founded her collective, Femmes Noires Musulmanes au Québec. So this collective aims to create safe spaces for black Muslim women in Montreal to discuss experiences of sexism, racism, and Islamophobia.
However, it has been found that the collective has been met with pushback from non-black Muslim women because they have felt excluded, but many do not understand that the collective was only open to black Muslim women because when the group did open up for the third event to all Muslim women, a very few of them showed up.
And then additionally, in Chapter 10 of Faith or Fight, so Abdurraqib, the author, describes instances in which she was faced with Islamophobia, in which she was treated as actually a foreigner despite living in North America all her life. So she has been asked twice if she was a foreign exchange student and has also been told to go back to where she came from. And it is extremely frustrating that wearing a hijab, Muslim women are targeted by xenophobia and racism. But what is very unique in this case is the complete erasure of the black Muslim experience and a lack of acknowledgement for the displacement that enslaved peoples experienced during the slave trade. And many outside of this community seem to be completely unaware of this intersectionality and why their narrative has been especially suppressed, which is why we think that the text of Omar Ibn Said is especially important because it not only brings to light and contextualizes the contemporary and historical black Muslim experience, but it illuminates what is so unique about the black Muslim struggle and combats this erasure and misconception still present today.
This telling of history from the perspective of an African Muslim brought to North America in the slave trade is integral to understanding this unique intersectional experiences, as you've been saying, Elle, and often that intersectionality is overlooked and erased, as has been highlighted on what we've been discussing. These perspectives must be heard in order to properly uplift members of our community that seek safe spaces within our own groups to share and discuss common experience. So, in conclusion, to wrap up everything that has been covered so far, although Eurocentric erasure of Black Muslim experience began as a tactic to dehumanize enslaved Africans. It persists to this day in social, political, and cultural contexts. Omar Ibn Said's autobiography challenges the Eurocentric views and erasure on enslaved Black Muslims by showing his high level of education, the authenticity of the text, and depicting a perspective that is often suppressed. That is why this text, along with others that illuminate the Black Muslim experience and challenge Eurocentric narratives, are crucial in reframing the ways we understand intersectionality and history in our past, present, and future.
This podcast was prepared by the fall 2023 cohort of Isla 200 Islamic Civilizations at McGill University.